Yeah, so what we see is the same research project in many different ways. So the research project is basically, as we try to write in the book, a Cartesian, a René Descartes-inspired project, which is that we have access to our inner states. We can see what we want and need, and the mind is us, and the mind is the brain. Okay, so a set of reductions about who we are, and if we look at the world, it's different, and we'll show you a little bit about that. But there's a couple of baseline things we see all the time. The first one is that you can get it down to algorithms. You can create systems for understanding the data that people generate in their activity. And if you take me, where I work, what I click on, where I'm with my phone, where I drive, and so on, that's me. That's a very good picture of who I am and the kinds of decisions I make. The second one is atomized, that you can think of people as self-contained entities, that we are basically individual subjects that stand against objects and give meaning to the world in that way. And the last thing is that we're rational. Everybody knows that we're not rational all the time, but it's something, and there's been economists that go a little further and say that irrational might be a category we could use as well, but basically it's the rational-irrational model. And we think that's wrong. And I'll show you a picture here to explain what it is we mean. This is a picture from a project by a guy called Paul Radcliffe. And he asked people to take pictures of the best moment in a week, the time in the week that was best. And it's this lady, she sends a picture of umbrellas. And I think you know this kind of day in New York City where it's soaking wet, and she lost her crappy umbrella. The umbrella was destroyed by wind, and she tried to trash it. And when she tried to trash it, she saw that that happened to others as well, which meant that the most absurdly annoying situation of getting completely soaked and losing your umbrella became delightful because it was funny. It's funny that other people were in the same situation. And I think you can also imagine what that situation is like because you've been there, right? So you're connected to humanity in a bigger way than just rational processes. You're connected to humanity in the way that we understand each other. I was at an art museum in Los Angeles not long ago, and I met this guy that was sitting on a bench crying, and he looked at a big Syrian tapestry from the 1600s. And I asked him, so why are you crying? And he said, because I don't feel lonely anymore. I feel that somebody in a place I don't know 400 years ago felt exactly the same as me. So the picture was about paradise. And he just lost his mother. And he was thinking, where is she? What's going to happen to her? And somebody in a place completely distant 400 years ago had the exact same feelings as him. So he felt connected to humanity, and he didn't feel atomized anymore. He felt connected to something. And that's a fairly deep insight if you think about it. It is that we are first and foremost not thinking things. We're social things. We are geared into worlds, and if you strip us of our world, we make no sense at all. We're not interesting at all. It is how we are in the world that is meaningful. And we navigate our world through familiarity. You know this, I guess, when you go to a city you've never been to before. Everything looks new. Right now, the street you go down looks like the street to the baker or to the cleaner or something like that, because you're so familiar with your own city. But when you move to some place, I moved to New York City from Denmark 5 years ago, and it's only now I understand how extremely Danish I am. When I lived in Denmark, I didn't see it at all. It wasn't at the forefront for me. I couldn't see it. In the same way, when you stand in line for coffee, it's only when somebody breaks the rules of standing in line that you understand that there are rules for standing in line, right? So that our familiarity with the world is how we find our way around. And that whole layer is not in the data, normally. The understanding of how we act upon the world and how we make sense of it. In the philosophical tradition, they call that understanding as opposed to knowledge. Knowledge is data in the way that you have a fair bit of data. But understanding is how you interpret that, right? in the philosophical tradition, there's also been a debate about how do you make sense of lots of data. And Francis Bacon, 400-ish years ago, said that the conclusions will fall out of the data itself. If you look to the big data people, they will often say that we don't need theory anymore, we don't need interpretation anymore, because we have so much data now that it will conclude by itself. Okay? If this is true, you can't do that. You do it based on something. And it's only when you don't have familiarity with something that you need this kind of analysis that we're proposing. We basically are in the world already. We're always already in a world, and we're always already making sense of it before it even happens. So we know that's a chair without taking our subjectivity and looking at the object and then seeing what it is. We just know it's a chair, and we're very familiar with chairs. So what we say that there are three building blocks you need in order to be in situations where the business doesn't work, where you're not making sense. So if you, like systematically launch products that gain, 1 to 2% market share, you might want to think about it. So the first thing is a humanized mindset. So a mindset about humanity that's different than the rational one. The second one is what we call thick data, which is data about our familiarity with the world. And the third thing is what we call non-linear problem solving, and I'll give you a couple of examples fast. The first one is we say that differences. There's a big difference between properties about something and aspects about something. The property of a woman is that she's a woman. You can say that that's biological. It's pretty clear that you can analyze that. You can use natural science methods to see that. The aspects about whether she's feminine or not is an aspect. It's a human thing. It's layered into our familiarity with the world. And what we are proposing is that lots of people miss the aspects by only focusing on the properties. And that's what you get when you use natural science methods understanding humanity. Thick data is trying to analyze what does something mean? How are things layered into our behavior? So for instance, if you go to a bar and you see an attractive person winking to you at the bar, you would know within a second, without even thinking about it, whether it's suggestive, ironic, critical, whatever kind of all the options a small movement with the eye can be. Understanding that and the understanding of how you easily gauge whether that wink is suggestive or not, means let's leave together or not, is important for your success at that situation. And it's something you all know, but it's hard to analyze unless you get thick data. And the way we do that is we import it from the human sciences, so that is sociology, anthropology, and so on, that have methods in order to do this. And it analyzes what's below the threshold of awareness. Now, Mikkel told you before about sports. At the time when we're talking about this company that is in the sports industry, they called fitness sports preparation. If you think about that for a moment, the reason why it's called sports preparation is, of course, that you prepare yourself to win gold medals. The only reason for going to the gym or doing yoga or anything like that can only be, if you are in the mindset that sports is about winning, is to prepare yourself for something real instead of just going to the gym. And what we found when we looked at these things was we found what, in this case, we call it the little black dress phenomenon. But it was basically a fitness measurement tool for women that we found across generation, across geography, which was a dress that was a little bit too small. So it was an ambition, and it was layered into the whole reason they did what they did was embodied in that dress. And that's the kind of data that we call thick data. It's not the kind of data I guess you work with the most, and we're not saying that that's in any way wrong. We're just saying this is another type of data that can be very, very helpful if you don't have familiarity with an area. What we call default thinking, hypothesis-based inquiry, answers what and how much, research on what is and has been or is happening right now. And what we're saying is that there's another type, and we call it sense-making in the book, is an exploratory inquiry. You're not basing yourself on, you're not trying to test a hypothesis. You're trying to cast a net and understand patterns of behavior. And in the bottom, you can see the difference between correctness and truth. This is a classic Martin Heidegger distinction. He says there's lots of things that are correct, but that isn't true. So, for instance, if I ask my daughter, could you please put six plates on the table, she would go and put 6 plates on the table. And I come in and they're all in a stack. And I'll say, well, that's not what I meant. I meant around the table with forks and knives and stuff. And she would say, well, 6. So it's completely correct. There are 6 plates on the table, but that's not the truth about how we eat together, in a sense. And what we're trying to get to say is that there is a method for getting to that shared, common humanity truth about us. You want to say something?
Yes. And I just want to show you how one company works with this. It's a company that many of you know well. It's Lego. And many years ago, they were in trouble because they were losing money. But also they were expanding into territories that they didn't know so well. And somehow they got people wrong. At that time when we met Lego, they had some pretty strong assumption about what's going to happen to play. And one of them is, we're going to die because PlayStation is going to take it all. Another one was a phenomenon called instant trashing. Have you heard about this? The idea is that kids these days, they have no attention. You can't get them to do anything. So when you go into a toy store, the toy needs to be very noisy and very easy to play with, because that's the only way you can get their attention. They also had a creativity idea which was called crisp, cool, wow. And that was, anything was evaluated on, is it crisp, is it cool, or is it white? Nobody knew what it meant. But is it crisp, cool, or wow, right? So that means you can just do anything. That boys wanted evil, so you can see when they did Bionicle that it is dark and red and blood and death. And that girls wanted pink, and you can see that it was pink princess, everything was pink and so on. And basically they assumed that because of this, the brick has no future. We have to head in another direction. And they did that by launching a lot of new innovations that was beyond the brick. Software and toothbrushes and violent toys and all kinds of things, and it basically got them into trouble. They got a new CEO who at one point said, I think we need to understand, before we take any decisions, why do kids play? And what role do we play in that? And the first step in getting the human condition right, like Christian was talking about, is not really doing any research or meeting any consumers or anything like that. It's looking at the assumptions you have and trying to change the question. And we talk about this as framing your problem as a phenomenon. And that's a very academic way of saying it. A simpler way is try to ask your business question in a way that a person can experience. So, for example, the big business question for Lego at that point was, how can we sell more toys? It's a very natural, very good question. It's just that it's not something anybody experiences. And what they did is change that around to a question which was, why do kids play? It's a very simple little trick, but it does wonder, because you start looking at very different behaviors when you look at why do kids play. It's actually a little tricky if you look at a kid, why do they play? Jesus, I don't know why they play. They just do it, Yeah, but why do they play? And what Lego did was they spent half a year going out to kids, living with kids, observing kids, figuring out what's their world like, figuring out parents, figuring out how school works, and trying to go down to that thick data that could reveal why do kids play, and then try to make sense of that to find their own future. Now, this was a really interesting experience and lots of interesting stories. Here's one of them. This is a shoe worn by a boy in in Germany, I believe. And the shoe is 1,000 times more worth for him than a new shoe. And we ask him why. And he says, because it's worn in the right places, it shows that I can do a kickflipper. This shoe is worn in the right place because he has tried 1,000,000 times to do the trick on the skateboard that makes him stand out in the hierarchy among his friends. And if you look at that, it really means that he does not suffer from attention span or loss of mastery or de-skilling or anything like that. This kid is deeply into one thing, and he does it every day for hours and hours and hours and hours. And what Lego found was all the kids they met had this deep mastery of something. They met one little guy who knew everything about sharks. So he was building a shark in Lego, and they asked him, so what shark? Oh, it's the one with the 23 teeth, because there's one shark that has that, and he knew the whole history of sharks. Yes. Now, they also found another interesting thing, which was that a lot of kids, when you play with them, not talk to them, they reveal a big world of inside knowledge that we don't know as adults. We call it under the radar. We don't know it's there. So here's an example. It's a German boy who Lego met, and his mom told them that this boy was really bad at maths. He was not good at school. Probably had ADHD, and so on. And she was kind of worried about him. And to solve that, she had given him a trumpet. Do you think he was playing on the trumpet? Not really. But what he was doing was, he was doing something called fantasy football. And we observed that. And he was sitting with a big piece of paper. And then he was in like soccer. So he's going, and Luftkicker was going, and he was coming up with these imaginary football teams, imaginary players. And then he would make a statistic after 90 minutes of playing the game about who won. But not only that, he would also make probabilities of, if you put your money on Luftkicker against Litana, it's probably a 9-1, right? So here's a kid where his mom and probably his school and all the psychologists in the world would say he suffers from attention span. He's not good at maths. We're worried about him. But what Lego discovered was that behind all that, there was a kid who had so much talent and so much mastery, it's just nobody was seeing it. They took this insight and really thought about what does it mean for us. And basically, they saw three big things. One was kids have mastery and they strive for mastery. Anything that's difficult and complex and deep is great for kids. The other thing, this was the thing with the shoe and the skateboard, is that a lot of kids these days are looking for hierarchy. Meaning, if you ask any kid, so who's best at maths in your class, she will say, oh, that's Jim. And who's number 17? That's Jack. Ask any European kid, which Italian player scored the most goals 3 years ago? They don't know. And so we found hierarchies everywhere. So mastery and hierarchy. And the last thing was the sensation of building something big and complex and challenging. If you looked at those three things and just think about, so we're moving into girls' toys, we're moving into toothbrushes, violent toys with a lot of storytelling, and we're moving ourselves away from the core experience of building something, creating something. And you look at the three things that kids really need, which is mastery, hierarchy, and challenges. Lego found, but maybe the answer is just right here in front of us, and it's called a brick. Because a brick can give you mastery. A brick can give you hierarchy if you build something and show other people. And a brick can give you a challenge. And if there was a way we could put that idea into all the things we're doing, all the innovations we're coming up with, all the products we're coming up with, the way our shops look, the way our digital tools are going to look, And they took that very idea back to the break and mastery, hierarchy and challenges, and put it into their core offerings. So they created tools where kids could design their own Lego and get it printed, basically. They created Lego games that gave you skill and hierarchy, and they went into the digital universe with a much bigger precision than they could before. And if you ask the CEO, he says, today, they're number 2 toy company in the world. They're really profitable and successful. And not only because of that, but also because of that. If you ask him, he would say, well, there are 2 reasons. One is that we basically did the hygiene on the company, and we now have cost control, we know where we're making money, and all that you can learn in an MBA. So that was one thing. And the other thing was that now we understand why kids play. Hierarchy, mastery, and challenges. And we can put that into everything we do. Okay, so that's the story about how to do that. And in this book, we say there is a generic method behind this that any company could learn, any company can do if you do it right. If you start by framing your question as a phenomenon, then you dig into how people really are, how they really live, and get a thick understanding of that. Then you find the patterns in that and say, what are the interesting patterns? Then you say, what are the consequences for our business? And then you frame that as an idea that can create impact for your business. That's basically the simple way of doing it. It's really simple to say. It's not so easy to do, but it is simple to say. Because I just did it. Yeah. Okay. So really what we are saying is we think that in an age of a lot of big data and a lot of rational thinking, there is a need also for getting a little bit of humanity into business again. And there is a science of understanding people. It's called human science, anthropology, social science, political science, parts of economics, literature, linguistics, that has 100 to 200 years tradition of understanding people. And all they're really saying is there is something about us that's not on the surface, that can only be discovered if we kind of reveal it. And I think that one of the most emotional moments for me when I wrote this book was when I was listening to a song. I write and listen to songs at the same time. And there was this song by Tom Waits, which is called San Diego Serenade. And he sings about how he never saw the morning until he stayed up all night. And I can remember that from when I was a teenager, the first time I went out to a party and came home, and the birds were singing. It was in the summer, and I could just feel the sensation of what a morning really is. I never saw that before, and that's what he's singing about. He sings about, I never saw the sunshine until you turned out the light. He says, I never saw my home time until I stayed away too long. And then he's saying, I never heard a melody until I needed a song. And that's the very simple message that we have for you guys, that there is a way to get both the top layers of our experience as humans, but also get to the deeper layers, and both are needed in the future. Thanks a lot.